Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over Material UI's tabs component. This component is pretty much essential for any large application. I almost always see these tab components used in any Material UI project, and it's really a cool feature to have. Now, while it looks quite simple, under the hood it can actually be quite complex, especially in Material UI's documentation. We're also going to look at how we can use tabs with React Router so that when you, for example, are on a page, if you were to click on a different tab, the URL would change in your browser, and if you were to go to that URL, it would by default start off on the tab that you want it to. So, and just as a reminder, if you find value in this video, it would really mean a lot if you either like, subscribe, or leave a comment. I try my best to respond to every single comment that's posted, and it just really helps with the YouTube algorithm to get these videos out there to more and more people. So, and thank you again for all the people that have been commenting quite a bit. So let's jump straight into the documentation first. As we can see here, Material UI has quite a couple examples of how you can do different tabs, but we're going to be focusing on the simple implementation. Now, if we look at this tab here, we can see that all it is pretty much a tab bar that allows you to switch between items, and as you switch between items in this nice little padded gray area here, depending on what item you have selected, a different item will show up below there. And you can see also when I select something, I'll get a nice little indicator at the bottom there. Now if we go ahead and expand this code, it's actually not as simple as it might seem. In fact, it looks quite complex. And the good news is it doesn't actually have to be this complex, and let's quickly just sort of run through what is going on here before we go into our own example and show you guys how to do it. So we can see here the first thing they're doing is they're creating this component called the tab panel, and it sort of looks a bit complex. There's all these random things being passed into divs and a bunch of conditionals with this box component that I'm not sure a lot of people have seen before. But all this tab panel is essentially is they're making this nice little gray area down here for the item to be displayed. So if that's something you're interested in creating this nice little gray area where your component will be whatever component you want to render for every tab will be displayed in, then you can go ahead and copy that code. But all that really is doing is just creating a div that is sort of styled to their specification of how they wanted to display the tabs in their documentation. So you don't actually need this tab panel component, although it could be helpful depending on what you want your UI to look like. This A11Y props, this is pretty much for accessibility mostly. In most applications, if you're just building this stuff to learn, you won't have to worry about any of that. And then finally, we get to the actual tabs component. After some styling that they've done. So you can see here that the first thing they're really doing is they're setting a value, and this value is essentially going to be which tab is currently selected. Now it might be a bit confusing because you might expect, for example, us to give each one of these tabs an ID, and then whenever someone clicks on the tab it would just equal to the ID. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, and the way it actually does work is Material UI will pretty much just give every single one of these tabs its own ID that starts as an integer index from 0, and it will have that as the value. So for example, when I'm on item 1, the value of which tab is selected is actually 0 because it's the first item in the tabs list. When I'm on item 2, it will be 1, and when I'm on item 3, it will be 2. And while that's not completely necessary to know for the basic tab element, that will become extremely useful when we're looking at the actual routing part of things. The next thing we do is we just have a little handler thing, and all it really does is it passes in the event which is not actually being used, and then the new value which comes natively from the tabs component, which we'll see in just a second, and we're essentially just setting the new value. So this function will be triggered whenever we click on one of the tabs up here. As soon as we click it, it essentially sets the value of our state variable to whatever the value of the new tab that we just clicked was. Now if we go down here into the actual JSX, you can see here that the actual tabs code is pretty much just in here. You can see they're wrapping the tabs in an Appbar, and that is what is giving it sort of this nice color. If you weren't to wrap it, which I'll show you in just a second, it'll actually just look like blank tabs. It'll just have a white background and it won't have this sort of nice blue aesthetic to it. And then finally, we get to the actual tabs declaration. So we're using actually two distinct material UI components here. We're using tabs and tab. Tabs is essentially the entire tabs bar. This is where you pass in the value, which tab is currently selected, the on change, and then the aria labels. This is essentially just for accessibility, for people that, for example, use screen readers, or for people that might not be able to see as well and are using, for example, like accessibility tools like clicking tab to switch between things. This is the text that will read out to people if they have accessibility tools enabled while they're surfing your website, or whether when, for example, if they hover their mouse over one of your components, it'll say simple tabs examples, so the person will know where their mouse is. And then finally, you get into these tab components. And you can see here, we're passing in all the A11Y, all the accessibility props in before. We don't actually need that unless you're making an application that's going to be accessible, and it's, you know, not just something you're doing to learn. But essentially, the thing we want to focus on here is the label, which is actually the text that will go in each specific tab. So it's pretty simple. We have our tabs, and then they just declare every single tab. So tab 1, tab 2, and tab 3. And then down here in the tab panels, you'll see here what they're doing is they're saying, okay, this index is 0 and the value is 0. So pretty much what is happening behind the hood for this tab panel, as we saw before, if the value equals the index, then they're going to display this. Otherwise, it's not going to display anything. And that's how they're switching between them. I like to do it another way, which I'll show you once we move on to the code sandbox. But this is just for your understanding how they're doing in the Material UI documentations. And then in the other examples, they have a lot of different examples that are more complex to do with styling. For example, if you want a tab to be disabled, and all that type of stuff, if you want the tabs to be centered in the middle, this is really only used if you have a really big application, or sorry, a really big viewport, and you don't want things to be like kilometers away from each other or miles away from each other. And yeah, there are a lot of other cool examples, but I think just by understanding what we saw up there, it should be pretty easy to pick up what's going on, everything else. As you can see, it pretty much works in a very similar manner. You're just using different props when it comes to what you're passing into tabs. So before we jump into Code Sandbox, let's quickly just look at some of the more common props that you're going to be using in the API when it comes to this. When it comes to the tabs component. So for example, if we already covered what centered was just above. It'll just make all the tabs sort of go towards the center of the tab bar. Children, this is most likely always going to be tab components that you're passing in. Classes, just like all the other Material UI components, is essentially for any specific styles you want to overwrite within the tabs. Other important things include like indicator color. You can change it. By default, it's secondary, but that's essentially just the color of that little tab at the bottom. On change, which is just where you pass in the set value. And then I think those are mostly, and then value is probably the last big prop that you're going to want to use for just setting up simple tabs. So let's jump into our Code Sandbox and actually create it. So I've created a little mock application, and I'm going to walk you through the structure really briefly. So we have our application, and I've set up just really basic routing. So if you're not familiar with React Router, don't worry about it. This is just super basic stuff for the next example we're going to do, where I show you how to sort of hook up tabs with actual routing. So you can see here in our app, I'm just making it render this home page. And essentially what we're going to try to do here is we have a home page, and we also have an about and contact page. On our home page, I want it to have a tab bar where I can switch between about and contact. So when I click the about tab on our home page, it'll show everything in our about.jsx, which is pretty much just the div that says this is our about tab. And for contact, it's the same thing. It just shows this is our contact tab. So that's essentially the goal here. And I've just set up basic routing. So we're going to be working in this home component. And we can go ahead and we can even look at some of the code and copy over the things that are going to be usable. For example, one of the things that's going to be usable is are these two things. So the handle change and the actual state variable that they have in here. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add this in here. I'm also going to rename this to something that's a bit easier to identify since value is a bit ambiguous. Let's call it, for example, tab selected. Selected tab. That makes a lot more sense. And then we can have set selected tab over here for our state variable. If you're not familiar with React state, all this is doing is this is our state variable and this is the setter function for our state variable. And then when handle change is called, we just want to call set selected tab with the new value, the new tab that is selected. So it will change what selected tab is. Now if we actually look into our JSX, we can come in here. I'm going to go ahead and import tabs, tab, and Appbar. First, I'll show you what it looks like without Appbar, and then I'll show you what it looks like with Appbar, and then we can probably keep Appbar. So what we're going to do is we're just going to copy in pretty much these couple lines. And this is just everything from the tabs. So we can go ahead and change the value here to selected value. We can keep the on change, and we can get rid of the aria label over here. And down here, we can get rid of these props that are being passed in. And since we only want 2 tabs in our example, because we just want one tab for the about and one tab for the contact us, we can leave it like that. And then we can go ahead and change this label to say about, for example, and this to say contact us. Okay, there we go. And it looks like we're getting JSX error. Oh, we just have to close this tag right here. And there we go. So if I go ahead and refresh, we'll see here that what we have here is a very basic tabs functionality going on here. Nothing's being displayed depending on what is being shown right here, but you can see that we have at least the functionality. And as promised, let's look at what the difference is when we wrap it with an app bar. Oops. Oh, need a capital B here. Okay. Cool. So when we wrap it with the app bar, all it does is it sort of changes the color and it extends the color all the way till the end. So it looks a bit more, I guess, cool. We can keep it like that. It's not that big of a deal. I believe in their examples, they also pass in position static so that it's always in the same position regardless of how you scroll, which is a nice to have. It won't really affect us because we're not really scrolling very much, but we can keep that nonetheless. But yeah, you'll also see that because the position is static, it will have that same little, as I talked about in the Pokédex series, that same little margin that's being applied there. So just in light of that, we can either keep the position static there, or we can remove it and not have to deal with it. If we keep it there, we'll either have to set the padding in the we'll either have to manually set the margin here in body to be equal to 0 as a style, or we can import Materialize CSS baseline, which will reset all of that for us, which is also an option that we can use. But for now, let's just remove it and keep it out of the application. So now that we have this here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to add the logic here to show either our about page or a contact us page, depending on what is actually selected. And if you're not doing this with routing, it's actually pretty simple. I'm going to go ahead and add some React fragments so that we have some a top level child to go ahead and add more stuff down here. And I can just simply add logic here. Well, first, actually, let's import both of them. So import contact from /contact. Import about from /about. And now that we have both those components, we can just say if selected tab is equal to 0, which is the first tab, we can display and we can display the about. And if we go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and quickly do the same thing for the one at the bottom. Contact. And I think this is actually getting displayed. It's just being hidden behind. If I change variant equal to static again, or sorry, position. Yeah, we'll see that. and change this back to 1, we'll see that this actually is rendering dependent on what we actually have. And you know what? We might as well even go and import CSS baseline just to show you guys how this works. CSS baseline. So we can go ahead and import it from the same place. Might as well import it. Yeah, we can put it here. And we could go ahead and import it and add it into our index. And there we go. Now we see that it sort of like sets everything. It removes that weird like padding and stuff like that from the thing. And now our content isn't being hidden under the Appbar either. So that is pretty much basic Appbar functionality. You can pretty much in your about page style it based on whatever you want to show there. Now let's talk about how we can go ahead and hook it up to routing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back into our app.js, and I'm going to, number one, I'm going to get rid of this line, which what it does is it automatically shows the home page based on just having a slash. And I'm going to make it so that it only shows the home page when we're at /home/something. And it's going to pass that /something, aka the page variable that we want, into home as a prop. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then type in /home on our application. And you'll see here that right now it's defaulting to the About tab. But it's going to be a bit hard to do that once we start working in here, and I'll show you what I mean. So first things first, let's go ahead and actually get the ID, get that page name from React Router into our component itself. So, and the way that happens is it passes it in through props. We can destructure an object called match from props. Oops. And then from match, we can destructure params. That's my cat in the background. And this is natively how React Router, by the way, will nest your param objects, in case you were wondering why it's so complex to get to it. And then finally, we can actually get whatever we called our variable here, which is just called page, from params. If I were to go ahead and console.log page here, if I open the console, you see right now it's undefined because we're just on /home. But if I go to about, we'll see here that it'll say about. Now, one of the functionalities we also want here is that when I go to /home, I want it to automatically route me to /about. So one of the ways, that way that tab is automatically selected. And one of the ways we can do that to set the default, to set that default path is just adding a redirect in React Router. So we can add redirect, and then we can go ahead and say, we want an exact match, and we want to redirect from /home to /home/about. And this will make it so that whenever someone just types in /home, it'll automatically redirect them to /about and have this tab highlighted just to keep things robust. And you'll see why we need that in just a second. The reason is because right now we are setting our initial state for what tab should be selected to just 0. But what if someone typed in /contact? We would want them to automatically have the contact to be defaulted. But if we are, and we get that contact variable from the parameter that we pass in from React Router, from this page variable right here. So we are going to want to somehow map that page name, for example, contact, to our React state that correlates with which tab is selected. And if we have, for example, someone just goes to /home, well then page would be undefined, and we would just have to set this state to undefined, which we would not want. We could even write some logic to have it say that if page is undefined, then just set it equal to 0. But the problem with that is then the URL still would just show /home and it wouldn't show /about, which for other reasons is not the best practice either. So in order to do this, one way we can do this is we can create sort of these maps that map between the index for your tab and the name of your tab. So for example, I can say const tab name to index is going to be equal to, for 0, it's going to be about, and for 1, it's going to be contact. And then I can make the same reverse object here as well. So index to tab name object. And I can say about and contact is equal to 0 and equal to 1. And obviously you can put this you can add both of these and just keep them in one object. It's not that big of a deal to destructure them to both. I just like having constant lookup time. But obviously you're not going to have like n amount of tabs in your application, so it doesn't really make the biggest performance difference. I just prefer doing this because it's sort of like cool practice. If you do a lot of work and stuff like that with hash maps and stuff like that, it's nice to have constant lookup for both ways. So now what I can do here is the state that I want, all I have to do is call this index to tab name, because I know what tab I'm going to have. I know what the tab name is going to be, but I don't know what index that correlates to, and that's what this map helps with. So I can say index to tab name of my page, and what that will do is, if it's, for example, about, if the page name over here is about, then it will set the name to 0, and if it's contact, it will set to 1. So let's go ahead and refresh this and see if that worked. And we can see here right now, I initially went to /contact and bam, it went to the contact us tab. And if I were to go to about, it would bam show the about tab. So it knows what to set the default to. Now we have to write the logic to handle, for example, when I click this, we want it to actually go also to the next thing. Now one way we can do this is we can get history from props as well. History is coming from React Router. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to change the URL by doing something called history.push. So what I can do here is, before it sets the new tab value, I could do a history.push. And I want the history to go to slash, I still want it to be /home, but then over here, I want it to be slash whatever our tab name to index of our new value is. So now when I click contact us, we'll see here that not only does it show the contact tab, but it also changes our URL to /contact. It keeps it consistent. And the way this is working is, when we are handling a change, we know what index the new tab is, but we don't know what URL, we don't know what that page name that correlates to. And that's what this object right here helps us with. We can say, okay, we're going to the tab that has an index of 1, and the page name that correlates to that is contact. So when we do history.push home blah 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 and then tab name to index of new value, it knows to set that to contact. And that is pretty much how you can get it working with React Router. I hope you guys found value in this video, and if you did, once again, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment below. I love hearing suggestions on what you guys want to hear next, suggestions on what I can do better, and I try to respond to every single comment, and I really appreciate you guys leaving comments. I've had a blast interacting with everyone in the comments section, and you guys all seem like you're pretty interested in learning, and I wish you all the best, and I hope everyone's staying safe, and thanks for watching.